In western Namibia, the waves of the Atlantic crash onto a large sea of sand. The country is 1.5 times the size of France, is inhabited by 2 million people, and nearly all of it is a deserted landscape. The regions in the north, however, are an exception. The rivers and rains attract a large population who mainly live on agriculture. The government counts on a green Namibia to ensure the country's food supply. But in 2009, this region experienced the most dramatic flooding it had seen in 40 years. The government declared a state of emergency and asked for international help for the thousands of people without shelter and who had seen all their possessions washed away. The region of Caprivi, in the northeastern tip of Namibia, is a narrow strip of land whose boundaries, inherited from colonial occupation, form the strange shape and gives the country access to the Zambezi River and the floods. The Lozi have always lived in harmony with the regular rhythm of seasonal flooding. From childhood, they learned to play, laugh, and move in these rivers. But with the changing climate, the waters of Caprivi have become synonymous with misfortune.
My name is Ruben Mafati. I'm coming from a farming family, and I also grew in farming activities. I used to help my parents as well, but with the climate change, and that we cannot predict the rain anymore. When it comes to farming, it's a gambling business.
Ruben, like most of the Lozi people, does not understand the changes to the climate in the last few years. When all of the Caprivi rivers overflowed in 2009, his village in the region of Kwando was not spared. Note, a region is not a tributary. A tributary is a smaller river emerging from a bigger river. Many crops and houses were damaged. The inhabitants most affected had to leave the village.
Right, this is my village, and we have a lot of houses like this one destroyed by the flood of last year, 2009. Our houses are built in a very traditional way, built on such grass, and then we're using the mud as wall. And this mud, if you have flood coming in, it's very easy for the flood to break in, and you have water in your houses, like what happened in its place.
Ruben talks often of his uncle Bernard, who is also the chief of the village. Bernard did not leave his ruined house, and memories of the 2009 flood are engraved in his soul.
I remember when the flood came. I was sleeping and I woke up with a start. There was water in the house. It was in the middle of the night, long before the crow of the rooster, and I had to wait till dawn to see anything. When I was finally able to get out, there was water everywhere. Everyone was still sleeping, and when I called for help, no one responded. It was horrible. I thought that I was going to die, and so I screamed. I screamed for help. When the people from the village finally arrived, they found me hanging from a tree. That day, it was really hard. I lost everything.
During the last floods that we had, most of our houses were flooded. And currently now, some of them have even moved to the upper land. We need to find a place, a permanent place to move to.
For the time being, the families are divided between two places, and Reuben would like them to be together again. For more than a year, Reuben and the villagers who no longer have a home relocated to tents in higher ground. But all of the resources that they depend on, such as water, cattle, or pastures, are still in their old village, which is 2 kilometers below.
The flood situation in our area does not only destroy houses, but also it brings along diseases. It brings along ticks for our livestock. Like currently now, we have experienced that some of our livestock are dying just because of the skin disease.
Hey,
and because open areas where we usually take our animals for grazing, it's now covered with water. So we have lost grazing areas, we have lost our grasses. So with this flood, we have lost a lot of resources that we were depending on.
After 2 consecutive years of flooding, the impact on the daily lives of the villages is significant. Despite the attachment that Reuben has for his village, he thinks it would be best to move and start a new life. This question provokes debate among the villagers.
Now the idea is the whole village to come to this place because this is on the higher ground and there's no way the flood can come to this area because it's high enough. But the problem we're facing, even in our village, some people cannot really afford to build a new house and they cannot use their old material like grass because it's now rotten on the roof. And also here the problem that we will face is that there's no water. If I want to fetch water, I still have to go back to the old village to go and fetch water from there because where we were, we had a borehole and it's still working. That's why our people, our families, some of them are saying it's very difficult to really move. We're trying to convince everyone since the flood, we're expecting a high flood this year again. But the problem that we will face is resources to try and help them and make sure that they all move permanently here and resettle here and build their villages and homes here.
The older villagers, like Reuben's mother, are reluctant. The old woman knows that she can no longer work the fields and she will have to depend on her son. She constantly mumbles about the poor quality of her corn. In 2009, the flooded fields were unable to maintain enough grains for the following season. When it was time for plowing, the sky remained obstinately blue, too blue for hopes of planting in a timely fashion. In November, typically the rainy season, the fields remained desperately dry. The late rains and the extent of flooding restricted the growing period of the crop and had drastic consequences for the survival of the farmers.
Last year's flooding reminded me of the one we had in 1958. That one was very strong. We also had a flood in 1968 and in 1978. But then we did not have a flood for about 30 years, and I think we had forgotten the damage it can do.
What differences do you see between the floods we've had recently and the ones that we had in the past, such as 1958, 68, or 1978?
The difference is now it takes us by surprise. In the past, there were years between each flood, but now it's every year.
After 30 years of drought, the return of the floods was a surprise. The rise in water level is hard to predict because the majority of rain does not fall in Namibia, but in Zambia and in Angola, which is where the Caprivi rivers get their water source. The system to prevent the floods requires the perfect coordination of information from several countries.
The use of my work is to inform people about the danger approaching us, to let them know how is the water is rising and how it's moving. This morning, the water level is 6.9 and the water level is still rising.
Today, in Katima Mulilo, the news of the increasing water level is frightening. The level of the Zambezi is dangerously high. The river has already leapt out of its bed to invade the plains.
Yeah, hello. Huh?
Reuben learns that in the eastern plains, the flooding has begun.
Ow! Ay,
He leaves to join his friends in Kalimbiza, who once again must flee from the floods of the Zambezi. The climbing waters force them to seek refuge at the other side of the road on higher ground. After 2 hours of being on the road, Reuben finds his friends and accompanies them to their village.
Covered with water.
All access to the village of Kalimbiza is now cut off. Reuben shares his friends' emotions. He understands their dismay that it could take several months for the water to leave.
This is my house, all flooded. There is water even inside here. Here. I am evening. Yeah, that was my bedroom. This was my sitting room. That one is for my children. If I happen to get somebody as a donor to assist me, I can just move to a higher land where there is no water. This is what happened last year in our village, whereby water came one by one. Each courtyard it was getting flooded and we had to move. It's strange that when they get flood here, for us we are still fine. But when we hear from these people from the eastern side, if they inform us to say the water now is getting down, then we will start preparing because we know for sure that the water is coming back now to our areas.
For us farmers, with the changing of the weather, we no longer know what to do. We see that our crops are being destroyed by floods, and this year it is happening again. Everything is underwater. We can no longer live on agriculture. We can no longer grow crops, and we have nothing else to feed our family.
The eastern section of Caprivi is always the first region touched by the floods, and it serves as a warning for the others. Ruben will also collect useful information for his community.
It was not flooded like this. The water was passing just there, but in our village, they not cross all the village, they just passed. But this start from 2007, 2008, last year 2009, also this year 2010. We don't know, maybe even next year. The school is not flooded, but it's surrounded by water. But sometimes you'll see this road is cutting by water, always. Unless I take my children to put him like this, to pass the water, to leave him there. And when they come back from the school, we go where the water is scattered. You take your children. It's how we live.
Over the past few years, the villagers of Kalimbiza have suffered the consequences of the increasing extreme weather conditions. They save what they can with their meager resources. Left to themselves without any help, they wait until they can register as victims to receive government aid.
So, this year, will it start again?
In the past, the floods would touch only a few houses. It wasn't dangerous. We could stay in the village and shelter those who had problems. It's only in 2009 that we had to all leave the village, and then again this year.
I have a feeling that it's going to be worse this time.
This year was really bad. The floods were catastrophic. It is far more important than last year because the water has accumulated. Last year, it took over a month for the village to be covered in water, and this year, it has only been 15 days and it is already covered. The house is destroyed, the field is lost. We have no more food. We have nothing. On top of that, in fleeing, many have lost their papers and identification documents. It's a big problem.
After the flood, will you return to your houses?
Of course, here we may be dry, but it is not our land. We are not at our place. We would rather be in the village.
The villagers attempt to reuse anything that they can to build shelter. But the main difficulty is to find land that will host their temporary camps. The traditional chiefs, or landowners, are often reluctant to let them set up camp, as they are worried that they may try to settle permanently.
This is my new house. I had no one to help me, and being a woman, it was not easy to build a shelter. Today, my brothers are here. When I first came, I had to sleep outside with my children.
And if there's a repeat of the floods, what will you do then?
If it starts again, I would like to move for good. But the state would need to help us with this land issue, to obtain land where we can install the village permanently. And also to make some levees where we can cultivate our fields.
Mostly, the land is communal, and all the decisions are made on an agreement between the tribal authorities and the government.
Have you noticed the changes in the rainy season?
Since the large flooding began, the main problem is that the rain has shifted. This year, for example, they only arrived on the 18th of January instead of starting in October. It is far too late to sow, and now, mid-March, our fields are flooded and we cannot harvest.
To improve and diversify their revenue, some Kalimbisa farmers have found a solution. They joined together to manage a government project on fish farming.
For the past few years, we've had repetitive floods, and each time, our harvests of corn and sorghum have been lost. It's all our work that has been reduced to nothing. But with fish, even if we have a flood, we will have something to sell.
Yes, it brings us money. That is why I work on this farm. I can at least pay for my children's schooling and can buy other things. The fields, when they are flooded, we cannot move. We cannot harvest anything. Everything is lost.
The level of the Zambezi increases every day, and soon the pools will overflow. Time is of the essence to relocate and save the fish.
So we are busy relocating the fish from those unfenced ponds to these two fenced ponds, as you can see. So the purpose of shifting the fish from there is that this structure is meant for security. That's where we secure our fish when there is more flooding.
Do you mean to tell me that last year, because of the flood, you lost some of the fish?
Yes, we're only left with few fish that escaped with the flood. All these ponds were flooded, including the fenced ponds.
But then the fence was still up.
Yes, could withstand the flooding.
Okay.
They hope that by transferring the ponds, it will succeed in helping save their farms once again this year. The return of major floods has encouraged the development of aquaculture, but the closeness of the river, indispensable in the functioning of the farms, makes them vulnerable to the floods. On the way home, Reuben stops at the home of an experienced farmer whose fields are directly situated along the river. This farmer refuses to leave his land, and the challenge posed by the flooding disrupts the farming calendar.
That is my land. Normally I cultivate in November or December, but this year it was still flooded, so I took a chance and planted in February.
But I don't understand. We're in March now. It's the end of the rain season. How are you going to manage? It's a risk, isn't it?
I am not waiting until after the rain. I'm going to take advantage of the flood water. It is still at least a meter underground, and it will give me enough humidity for my crop to grow. If we do not have a flood in the next month, then I will have succeeded. It is better to try many times in different periods rather than to let the earth fallow. Besides, we never know when the rains will come. Too early, too late, or not at all. It's not like it used to be. We can no longer count on the rains.
We've been flooded for 3 years, and if it continues yearly, 2010, 2011, then what will we do in the future?
Yes. What can we do with all that water? We should find new crops that can adapt to the conditions. Our traditional crops, like the corn or the sorghum, will not survive in the floods. For example, we could grow rice.
In response to the flooding of Caprivi, Professor Kanyo Medka from the Faculty of Agriculture of Namibia completed a project that is revolutionizing the agricultural and cultural practices. At this critical point, he comes to check on his crops.
Previously, we used to have floods, but not so much. And this is where we see that climate change actually is real. It's not just something people talk about, because we have seen it happening. Previously, we were able to predict after 7 years, maybe you have a relatively high flood. But the highest was last year, and now we are already beginning to see this. It is becoming extremely impossible for farmers to grow their conventional crops. It is quite a problem. The flooding is getting worse and worse. We look for alternative crops that can grow in such areas, and we thought of rice. 14, average 14, 15 tillers from one plant. And today, these days, the challenge of climate change is facing the world all over. And for Africa, it's even worse. So if we can come up with crops that can grow under such environment, flooded areas, that will be very good for us in terms of increasing food security.
The exceptional flooding in 2009 received the attention of the government, and regarding Professor Kanyo Medka's project, is considering the growing of rice as a positive response to the natural catastrophe hitting the country. The president of Namibia came and declared the rice project of Kalimbiza a national program.
Last year, good enough, and we are so excited that rice survived even when we had the biggest flood in 40 years, I was told. But we still had rice harvested from these fields. As you see, we have selected quite a number of varieties that are very tall. For example, where we are now, even if it floods to the maximum, it will not cover these varieties. There are some short ones which we are selecting because we have screened them for other times of the year. But with this kind of variety, there is even one which is taller than me. It's growing on the other part of the farm. So rice can be a crop for the future in flooded areas like this.
The last harvest from this promising crop was excellent. Professor Kanyo Medka sent technicians to Japan, as he does not want to leave his project in its experimental stage. He dreams of expanding the cultivating of rice to all the small farmers. Ruben continues on his way and meets workers engaged in a race against time. They must raise the road and change the diameter of the pipes to improve the drainage system before the floods cut off all the access routes.
What are you doing here? What's happening?
At this point where we are now, last year people could cross from the other side going this side. It was a big hole where water was passing through. So now we are responding to that disaster which happened so that people can cross from this other side to the other side. Right up now when I'm talking to you, water is just about 2.5 kilometers from this tree.
Are you going to manage to finish the work in 2 days' time?
Definitely, we have to. If we have to work even overnight, we have to. Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Ruben is worried. This year, the flooding of the Zambezi will be just as bad as last year. Arriving in his village, Ruben gives the information to his uncle Bernard. He wants to know the feeling of the old people in regards to moving the village. Their opinions will matter.
We need a meeting. The decision must be unanimous. Everyone goes or everyone stays. Some people have left already, but the elderly, like me, have stayed thanks to God in a lifeless village.
Ruben took Bernard's advice and organizes a meeting. He reunites families to discuss the moving of the village and to make a final decision.
I've called for a meeting because the level of the Zambezi has risen and our cousins in the east are already flooded. We know that this water will be upon us in about 2 months. I don't want to twist your arm, but I think we need to make a collective decision to move the village.
We must leave. No, we are staying.
So, who wants to speak?
If the water comes, we will have to leave. We are not going to lose everything again. I think it is a good time to move now. We need to find a secure place. 2 years of flooding is enough.
That's Angelina's opinion. Any other thoughts?
I don't see the need in moving, because over there, we may not be winners. We know what we are leaving in our homes, but what will we find? Nothing. We are going to be parked in a camp. In that case, we need help. Let the state intervene. Otherwise, we will have no roof. So why leave? To get rain on our heads?
Here, at last, we have a well with drinking water. But if we move to higher grounds, there will be no water. That means that we would have to walk down to the village every day to fetch water. I think we should stay here.
So what do? What benefit is it to have a well and a home if it's covered with water? What do you think, Maureen?
The flooding only lasts some time, while the water wells are being used every day. I prefer to stay here. Also, because of the flooding, we will not be able to find any materials to build anywhere else.
What will you do if water comes again this year and your house is flooded? Your field is flooded. What will you do? Ask for help?
It won't be the first time. When it comes, I will move.
I would rather move now, because when the water comes, it won't be alone. It brings with it many bad things. For example, the hippopotamus. Look around you, they're everywhere. It is a real problem that they can attack us.
We had visitors walking over there behind us, and bang! A crocodile caught one of them. He pulled him by the thigh, he pulled him far, and we have not seen him again. The problem is not only do we get hippopotami, but also crocodiles and snakes. I think in that case we should move.
A decision on moving has not been declared. The villagers are impatient, but the argument is still alive. Reuben is going with his friend to a cornfield that was ravaged by hippopotami. He is furious that a decision has not yet been made.
Are those the footprints?
Yes, do you see them? Look at the footprints. They are all hippopotami.
How many were there?
At least 2 or 3. They destroyed my field, my corn, and that is because of the flooding.
But what's the correlation between the floods and the hippopotami in your field?
Before the flooding, they did not come out here. The distance was too far. But now, with the flooding, they come through water channels. They are a lot closer. It's every day, every night. They trample my crops. And in the morning, I don't even see my own tracks. It's enough. I'm fed up. They eat everything. My corn, my squash, everything.
nuka yazambezi mwakati mwa muliro kuzwala 21 letamani iliza zilatu Namibia yamanuka yazambezi na yemifa 7.37 meters ilikuwekeza ka 1 centimeters kuzwala 20 letamani munda mwanuka yazambezi akulichwalo kabakala kuyajuwa hande kwa riba kamupita mezi asika kuma mikwakwa asapita mwatasi mikwakwa isari kwa mayemu amande airi kwa watu wapira mwariba kazi kwa nanguzwe uzi
In all the surrounding villages, with their overloaded boats, the people meet at the evacuation point. They dock at the edge of the school in Muzii, surrounded by the waters of the Zambezi. The government response unit, as well as the Red Cross, are in place. Sebastian is the logistic evacuation coordinator.
This morning, the Zambezi water reading is at 7.34, according to the hydrological report which have just been SMS on my cell phone. The early warning system is in place. As you can see, the people of Muzii We came to advise them on the level of the water. We are looking at the reports. Then we said, we must get you out here early, otherwise it's going to be a disaster. We don't want loss of life.
For the past few weeks, the groups have waited for information to move or convince the people to prepare to evacuate as soon as possible. The people are not in a rush to leave, however, and Dennis, a social worker, knows that he cannot force them to evacuate.
They don't understand what is the river level. They are just looking first, like at this school where we are now. They are still looking, the water must be either at this level or at that space where they can see now they don't move. That is when they will be sure that, yes, now you are talking. The water is with us and we need to move. Otherwise, if they just hear that the water is at the Zambezi River, and the early warnings and the information, wherever you are getting it, you are trying to pass it to people, they don't understand that. They will believe it that the water is here with us.
During the dramatic flood of 2009, the rivers of Namibia were under surveillance. In the Zambezi, Guido von Longenhol, hydrologist for the Ministry of Agriculture, collects data that allows him to predict the flood dates, but also their progressing evolution.
The specific thing we are doing here is that we measure the flow in the river.
The severity of the last flood allowed the use of high-tech hydrological equipment to give readings.
This system then collects through RTK GPS the position, and then it can collect as the measurement is going, as the boat is traveling over the water, it can collect the distances. And then you don't have to measure your distances by hand.
The reason why that is important for flood warning is that one must also give warning to the downstream people, and one must tell them how many cubic meters are coming and at what speed are they coming, so that they can take the necessary measures from that. And that helps us then also to give warning to the people in the floodplain, because we can tell them there's not only a lot of water in the river, but there's also a lot of water coming down in the floodplains. So that's how these measurements are used for flood warning.
The number of people affected by the floods depends on the disbursement of the water on the plains.
My colleagues in Zambia, they do the same type of measurements, and they pass that information on to us on a daily basis. And they sit at the places far upstream from where the water takes 2-3 weeks to get to Katima Mulilo. And so if the way they did it this year, we knew at the end of February already that there was a flood of this magnitude coming down to Namibia, and that would reach us the second half of March. And that is a good system because it gives us good warning.
Last year, the flood was devastating and killed many people because no one expected it. This year, with the surveillance of the Zambezi, it allows technicians to anticipate the event.
If you have a couple of weeks warning, you can evacuate the people before the flood is there, and you can use normal ground transport. If you wait too long, then the people are surrounded by the water, and then you have to evacuate them with boats, or in the extreme case with helicopters.
Despite a warning system, the people cannot be forced to evacuate. The villagers do not want to leave their community and their homes. They wait until the last minute, when they are certain that they have no other choice. Their late decision forced the government to organize an evacuation by boat. On the site of evacuation, the villagers are impatient. They do not understand why it's taking so long.
We've been waiting here 5 days, and there's nothing left to eat. The boats are too small, and they're not taking enough people on them each time. We cannot bring much with us, just the bare minimum.
The flooding is stronger and stronger, and we have to leave. But in the camps, they don't give us enough. We are missing sugar, soap, everything.
Over there, you have to pay to get help, to send your children to school or to buy necessary things. Where do you expect us to find money if we cannot bring anything that we can sell to generate an income?
There are too many of us here in the camps where we can catch diseases from the suffering and the promiscuity. We are on top of each other in the tents. We need to have more space. This is our community. We are used to being here and we know how to cope. Even if we have to do our own business behind a bush, we prefer that to the lives in camp. There we cannot seem to adapt.
The long list of criticisms betrays mainly the sadness and despair of people who have to leave their homes for possibly 6 months. The government boats evacuate the students and teachers from the school first, so that their classes resume quicker. All the land routes are blocked, so the boats must go up the Zambezi. Moving against the current is slow going. They limit the number of evacuation trips, which explains the wait at the village. The refugees are then taken to shore where they continue the voyage by road. Distraught and without any possessions, they look for clues among the bags piled around the truck. The Red Cross volunteers do all that they can to assure the uprooted people on their way to camps. Many of the villagers lived through it last year and know the conditions that await them. In dry weather, the camp is about 30 kilometers away. But with the rising water, they must take several detours, making the trip last all day. This long and complex evacuation adds to the separation anxiety. Slowly, the evacuees from Uzii settle. Some even put up their tents in the same place as last year.
During the evacuation on the Zambezi, I was really scared that the boats were too small. The journey from Uzii took a long time. It rocked a lot and we elderly were afraid of capsizing and of drowning. Anyhow, now we are dry, but they are last year's tents. They are not waterproof.
Reuben came to see the principal of the school in the refugee camp, which is 3 hours from his village. He questions the infrastructure problems posed by the evacuations. Reuben will face the same issues when he moves his village.
You see, it takes a long time, for evacuating later until they are resettled to a respective place. You'll find that in Milena, that's still there at Muzi. They are not yet completely settled at here, Caprivi. I'm still waiting for all of Milena to be present here as well now. Teaching will start teaching normally.
While waiting to be able to continue their lessons, the teacher talks to the children regarding the difficulties that they have encountered. They repeat in chorus what is written on the blackboard: flooding in Caprivi. The teacher then asks them to express what this means to them personally.
Kwani wasivakasa kwanza somile mananga ulia maluta avana wiketo anda kuli mana kuli muso wa supply andelika wana kuli ni mezi fa kuna mwaka na kuna za maluta to ndiko kanga kwani kuna mtato wako na kuvona
manyando to fita to toka liana kauna kuposa kaposa manze mwiza shwanga hakuna utofuta kuina nitala man the whole day moto a chischo tuvazo visa vasivakasa ona hakuna ande wiketo.
The school is a simple makeshift tent, and in these almost primitive conditions, the continuing education of the children has been handicapped.
Don't have access of lights whatsoever. And then from there, you see, we have to make copies when we make tests, make copies to give each individual learners. So we don't have access for computers, a photocopier. You see, we are just in the bush.
The Musii women and volunteers prepare food that is distributed to the students. Reorganization of the camp takes time, and the rations are insufficient. If and when the waters of the Zambezi invade the territories, the government is obliged to accelerate the evacuations to ensure the security of its people. The camps multiply and become real cities for thousands of people. Every family organizes what they can in order to obtain a small income. The refugees can supplement their food aid and try to adapt to their new living conditions. On the Kwando River, everything is calm. Water is still the source of life and remains an ally for the Lozi people dependent on fishing. For Reuben's mother, the fish remains a gift from the river. The time for the floods has not yet arrived, but the increasing of the current and the teeming streams are indicators. Not much time remains to prepare for it. The village has once again met, and Reuben uses the last hydrological updates to explain and convince them to move. On a map, Reuben shows the flooding already occurring in 2010 in the Zambezi. It is the second largest flood in the past 40 years after the one in 2009, and the season has not yet ended. He proposes a poll, as long as everyone accepts the majority vote. He needs to choose an unbiased person to organize the vote, and he selects young Mandela.
One, two, three.
Okay. Uzachora abashakukura.
Abashakukura 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17,
20.
Abakura 17. Abakabakuli? This 3. Okay.
Therefore, the majority have decided to move the village.
The question of moving the village became urgent. The decision is a relief, but at the same time causes apprehension within the elderly. Reuben decides to talk to his mother.
I'm happy that you made this decision, but to me you seem anxious.
I voted to move the village, but I don't know how we are going to do it. We cannot move a house, and I don't have the energy to rebuild one. It was fine when I was younger, but how do you expect me to cut down wood at my age? I am too old.
It will all depend on me. I have to do it for her because she can't do anything. So yeah, on me. So currently now, the plan is to go out there and look for employment. If maybe the year is bad for us, we have floods and this field is flooded, at least my salary, my income from the job that I'm going to look for can also help my parents and also help myself.
In 2010, the flooding had once again hit hard the people of Caprivi, forcing some of them to leave their land. These extreme climatic events undermine the hope for development in Namibia, this young nation, independent for only 20 years.